I keep hearing something about Trump that I feel compelled to settle before the election, just for posterity.
Have wars? I had no wars other than ISIS, which I defeated, but that was a war that was started. We had no wars. I could stop wars with a telephone call.
Donald Trump didn't start any new wars, so we are told. I know the statement is never really meant literally. Wars did start under the Trump presidency, and while you can say none of those wars involved American soldiers, by that standard, Biden also started no new wars. What people really mean, of course, is they didn't feel at war, unlike with Ukraine and Gaza. What most people who complain about the forever wars care about is not the human cost of the actual conflict, but the psychic inconvenience of being made to think about those conflicts. The problem for any president is that feeling is mostly a function of media coverage more than anything material. So, what I want to do today is make up for what the media didn't do 4 to 8 years ago. Let's talk about the wars of Donald Trump.
So, you've been elected president. It's your first day in the Situation Room. What 3 questions do you ask your national security experts about the world?
What we want to do, when we want to do it, and how hard do we want to hit? Because we are going to have to hit very, very hard to knock out ISIS.
It's worth remembering that Donald Trump didn't start his campaign as the End the Wars candidate. Trump was criticizing the war, of course, but it was in the context of, one, the traditional Republican complaint that humanitarian rules of engagement is getting in the way, and if you watch the debates, you'd be forgiven for not being able to tell which candidate was running the most anti-interventionist campaign.
And I voted against Barack Obama's plan to use force, and it was the right decision.
Of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's foreign policy, and sadly, too many establishment Republicans in Washington, is they focus on issues unrelated to protecting this country. They focus on nation building. They focus on toppling governments to promote democracy.
We should go to war when it is our direct interest. We should not be policemen of the world.
Not particularly in favor of us going to war in Iraq.
It wasn't just Trump who was looking for a way out of the Iraq War's shadow. But there was one man on the stage who didn't really have the luxury of being able to distance himself from George Bush.
So here's the deal. I'm sick and tired of Barack Obama blaming my brother for all of the problems that he's had. And while Donald Trump was building a reality TV show, my brother was building a security apparatus to keep us safe, and I'm proud of what he did. And he's had the gall to go after my mother.
The World Trade Center came down
He's had the
during your
gall to
brother's
go after
reign.
my mother.
Remember that.
Hold on.
I want to tell you, they lied.
Okay.
They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none. There were no weapons of mass
Okay,
destruction.
all right. Governor Bush.
This exchange, more than anything else, is what set Trump up as the anti-war dissident more than anything else.
What are we doing? We have to rebuild our country, but we have to. I'm the only one on the stage that said, do not go into Iraq. Do not attack Iraq. Nobody else on this stage said that, and I said it loud and strong.
And it's tempting to say the reason this worked was because Trump was lying, and people simply didn't know that Trump was lying and that he had also supported the Iraq War. But I don't think that matters. I think what mattered was that Donald Trump wasn't a politician. That allowed him to claim that it couldn't be his fault that we invaded Iraq regardless of if he supported it. He had been lied to. How could he have known better? His alibi is every Republican's alibi. It is now the alibi of 70% of Americans. Implicating Donald Trump is to implicate oneself. And for the conservative movement as a whole, this represented a breakthrough. Going along with the lie that Donald Trump was against the war was a way of creating a big lie. That the Iraq War was really just a creation of elites, or elites, rather than the conservative movement itself, which had spent 2002 feverishly working to turn American politics into a fetid neo-McCarthyite mire, in which people were simply too scared to dissent against the Bush administration. And that big lie is just what the Republican Party needed to get the albatross of the Iraq War off their neck, even as they campaigned on a platform of saturation bombing for northern Iraq.
We ought to start with using our incredible air power advantage. The first Persian Gulf War, we launched 1,100 air attacks a day.
Obviously, you're not going to accomplish all of your goals without some collateral damage.
Somebody criticized me the other day because they asked me what I'd do, and I said, I'm going to bomb the shit out of them. It's true. I don't care. I don't care. They've got to be stopped.
And this dovetailed well with the other fight Donald Trump had with Jeb that night.
And to allow Russia now to have influence in Syria makes it harder, but we need to destroy ISIS and dispose of Assad to create a stable Syria so that the 4 million refugees aren't a breeding ground for Islamic jihadists. This is the problem. Donald Trump brought up the fact that he would want to accommodate Russia. Russia is not taking out ISIS. They're attacking our team, the team that we've been training and the team that we've been supporting. It is absolutely ludicrous to suggest that Russia could be a positive partner in this. They are on the run. They are making, every time we step back, they're on the run. The question that you asked was a really good one about what you would do. What 3 things would you do? I would restore the military. The sequester needs to be reversed. I would have a strategy to destroy ISIS. And
let me just tell you this. Jeb is so wrong. Jeb is absolutely so. That's just so you understand. You know what that is? That's Jeb's special interest and lobbyists talking. At one time, if you listen to him and you listen to some of the folks that I've been listening to, that's why we've been in the Middle East for 15 years and we haven't won anything. We've spent $5 trillion in the Middle East because of thinking like that. We've spent and Lindsey Graham, who backs him, who had 0 on his poll.
The very basic fact is that Vladimir Putin is not going to be an ally of the United States. The whole world knows this. It's a simple, basic fact.
I've got a question
from a guy
for
who
Senator.
gets his foreign policy from the shows.
Oh,
this
yeah,
is a guy who thinks that Hillary Clinton was a great negotiator in Iran. We're living in dangerous times. This is a man who insults his way to the nomination.
Donald Trump's softness on Assad, if not outright support, is the other issue which was used to paint Donald Trump as a break with neoconservatism. But listen to the argument.
We're going to also have to learn who our allies are. We have allies, so-called allies. We're spending billions and billions of dollars supporting people. We have no idea who they are in Syria. Do we want to stay that route, or do we want to go and make something with Russia? I hate to say Iran, but with Russia.
It's not an argument for non-interventionism, but for shelving one priority, human rights, in exchange for an approach based on fighting the one great ideological foe, with a tacit implication that nothing is lost because Arabs aren't capable of democracy anyway. And I wouldn't call that a rejection of neoconservatism so much as a return to the original neoconservatism. Supporting dictators to fight a bigger ideological foe, ridiculing human rights, and implying certain people aren't really ready for democratic governments was the hallmark of people like Jeane Kirkpatrick, and by extension, much of the Reagan administration. Just like the Sandinista revolution proved Latin America couldn't be trusted not to choose communism, the Arab Spring proved Arabs can't be trusted not to support radical Islam. And the prescription? Back dictators to the hilt, no matter how brutal. So, it shouldn't be surprising that when Donald Trump took the White House a year later, most neoconservatives flocked back to him. And he did not, in fact, act like a dove.
Huge bomb had just gone off.
With a pro-Assad candidate in the White House, Assad reasonably assumed he'd been given a green light to handle the rebels as he saw fit.
Now to the apparent chemical weapons attack this morning in northwest Syria. The casualty counts range from 58 dead to over 100. Either way, it was one of the worst such attacks in the country's 6-year civil war.
Instead, Trump saw this as personally embarrassing to him, since a chemical weapons attack is the sort of thing that his ambient toughness is just supposed to automatically deter. So Trump demanded the Pentagon assassinate Assad for him. And at this point, it was suddenly the deep state which protected Assad from the anti-war populist. The Secretary of Defense simply countermanded the assassination order and waited for Trump to forget. Stymied, Trump settled on a smattering of Tomahawk missiles. The candidate who was supposed to team up with Assad to defeat the terrorists instead ended up doing what Obama wouldn't and bombed Assad, but only enough to look like something without actually changing anything.
President Trump says he will respond forcefully to what he calls the atrocious use of chemical weapons by Syria's government. The regime is suspected of attacking the rebel-held town of Douma outside Damascus with a chlorine agent. More than 40 people reportedly died. The president said a U.S. response is imminent, and it may extend to Syria's allies, Iran and Russia.
So much for deterrence through strength. When Assad did another chemical weapons attack a year later, Trump responded with a slightly larger set of airstrikes, after again being talked down by Jim Mattis. But even that was enough to spook the Russians, who organized a massive disinformation campaign about the attacks. That disinformation campaign immediately convinced the alt-right that Trump had betrayed them, and Trump started to realize he might be losing his base. And so, he did another 180.
Tonight, President Trump is defending his plan to pull U.S. troops out of northern Syria.
We only have 50 people in that area. That's a small sector. And I don't want those 50 people hurt or killed.
The president tweeting, "It's time for us to get out of these ridiculous, endless wars."
As ISIS had expanded east into Iraq, the only force that seemed to stand between it and Baghdad were the Iraqi and Syrian Kurdish forces. This made them a key partner for the American-led coalition that intervened to push ISIS out of Iraq. But when ISIS was defeated, that still left the problem of what to do with an ally that was permanently reliant on Western air power to keep themselves safe. Staying in northeast Syria would mean keeping America in an open-ended military commitment to Syria. But leaving Syria would mean letting the Kurds get crushed between Assad and the Turks at a time when they were busy policing the underground remnants of ISIS. By withdrawing troops from northeast Syria, Trump had opened the Kurds up to an attack from Turkey, but the Turks, not wanting to risk its own troops, sent instead their Syrian proxy force. A force that included former al-Qaeda-affiliated fighters, who did al-Qaeda-like things like chopping heads off of female Kurdish POWs. The withdrawal ended up costing over 1,000 people their lives and creating 300,000 refugees. And Trump was probably expecting to get thanked for ending a potential quagmire, but in the previous few years, the Kurds hadn't just gotten weapons from America, they had also gotten a massive amount of good press. So when he screwed them over, the reaction ended up being, well, negative.
The Kurds fought shoulder to shoulder with U.S. Special Operations Forces for 4 years against ISIS.
They led it, and they paid for it in blood.
What kind of partners did you find them to be?
Committed, dedicated, formidable.
Tonight, the president's plan is being slammed by many of his allies.
So he did another 180.
So Fox Business alert President Trump announcing new economic sanctions against Turkey, along with increased tariffs following its invasion of Syria. The commander-in-chief also saying U.S. troops coming out of Syria will now redeploy and, quote, remain in the region to continue to disrupt remnants of ISIS.
Donald Trump, trapped between two different intuitions of what plays good on television, was neither able to pull American troops out of the Middle East nor use them to protect allies. And he managed to both bomb Assad's forces while still strengthening Assad's hand. The anxiety that any Arab democracy would immediately fall to radical Islam extends into the Arab world itself, and it expressed itself in a very strange way 5 months into Trump's tenure. In 2017, Mohammed bin Zayed, president of the UAE, and Mohammed bin Salman, crown prince of Saudi Arabia, decided they were going to be the new Metternichs of the Middle East. They wanted to put an end to all this Arab Spring nonsense and roll the region back into a series of moderate but not necessarily secular authoritarian governments that could be conveniently organized into a tight anti-Iran coalition. With Trump's election, they realized they had a kindred spirit in the White House, and that now was the opportunity to make their first big move. One of the drivers of the Arab Spring had been the media, and in the Middle East there was only one major media organization that was pushing the Arab Spring.
Confronting power with courage, enlightening the darkest shadows to inform and inspire. For even if we climb up the same mountain, we still walk on our own path.
Al Jazeera is owned by the government of Qatar.
Egyptians watched the Tunisian revolution live on Al Jazeera, discussed it on Facebook, and took to the streets. Libyans watched the Egyptians, Yemenis watched the Libyans, and the Syrians watched them all.
Here at Al Jazeera, are you covering the news or do you have an agenda?
What is wrong with transforming the Arab world from tyranny and despotism into democracy? What's wrong with that? If there is an agenda, it's a very good agenda.
After the Egyptian revolution, Qatar started to get close to the Muslim Brotherhood, and Qatar was increasingly trying to take on the role of middleman between the various Middle Eastern factions. But Qatar is a small little country surrounded on both sides by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and they would rather take control of these things for themselves. So
Saudi Arabia and other Arab states cut off all ties with their neighboring nation of Qatar, sending the Persian Gulf region into a new crisis.
Do you remember the orb picture of Trump? Well, this is what the orb meeting was about. They're at the opening of the Global Center for Combating Extremist Ideology. and they took Trump there to teach him about how Qatar is the major source of extremist ideology, in order to get his blessing for the blockade. So what you have here, pretty straightforwardly, is an entangling conflict that Trump could easily diffuse by just saying no. He did not say no.
The nation of Qatar, unfortunately, has historically been a funder of terrorism at a very high level. And in the wake of that conference, nations came together and spoke to me about confronting Qatar over its behavior.
He didn't even bother to warn the State Department. So at the exact same time Trump tweeted out his endorsement of the Saudi blockade, the Secretary of State put out a statement condemning it. This sequence of events led to a conflict that was primarily fought in a whole new domain of warfare, the Washington lobbyist domain. The Saudis, Emiratis, and Qataris all dropped massive amounts of money throughout the city, commissioning as much propaganda as they could. They fought a war of corrupt business deals and think tank contributions instead of tanks and bombs. The Emiratis teamed up with Jared Kushner, possibly offering some kind of business deal in order to enlist his help getting rid of the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. And that seemed to be the winning move, except, well, the Pentagon was also furious about the blockade. Because America's biggest Air Force base in the Middle East is in Qatar. The president had just endorsed a blockade of his own Air Force. And you might say, well, that's not a real war, that doesn't count. And you're right. I only bring it up because it's going to be important context for what happens later.
President Trump, by recognizing history, you have made history.
The Saudi Crown Prince wasn't the only leader to see a golden opportunity in an ultra-transactional president. Benjamin Netanyahu also was ready to make a deal, and Trump delivered him a prize the Israelis had been waiting for decades.
The United States will officially move its embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem tomorrow. Protests are planned throughout the region tomorrow, including what may be the largest demonstration yet at Israel's border with Gaza.
Moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was seen almost universally as an American recognition of the annexation of East Jerusalem. The ensuing protests in Gaza against this were so large that the IDF dispensed with the normal tools of crowd control and instead switched to the more direct approach of just shooting people in the leg with live ammunition.
We're on the ground in Gaza as protests turn to funerals. The human toll of Palestinians killed by Israeli troops in one of the most violent days on the border in years.
60 people died the first day, but they came back the next day, naturally. And the next day.
These protests have been going on for 6 weeks now, with Gazans basically marching on the fence or the border around Gaza.
It took until the end of the year for the protests to peter out, and by that point, the IDF had shot 6,000 people. These shootings had a significant but not widely remarked upon effect on the conflict. For one, it gave Hamas the perfect opportunity to make the case that non-violent methods were useless. For two, it gave Netanyahu a massive sense of impunity. I mean, why wouldn't it? He had won everything betting on Trump, betting on the global wave of authoritarianism that Trump was also riding. And now he had shot 6,000 people and it barely made the news. Even the Arab world seemed mostly unbothered. There was no backlash at home or abroad. Visible backlash, that is. The Gaza shootings had a third effect. Slowly and quietly, it shifted American public opinion to the Palestinians. But not everywhere. Rather, it caused a gradual but massive shift in age and partisan polarization. For young Americans and Democrats, sympathy for Israel dropped and just kept dropping. So while the Gaza March shootings didn't warrant too much media attention at the time, the stage was set for things to come.
Moving on to the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Having inflamed both the Gulf crisis and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it was only a matter of time before Trump would flip the tables on Iran as well.
The Iran deal is defective at its core. If we do nothing, we know exactly what will happen. In just a short period of time, the world's leading state sponsor of terror will be on the cusp of acquiring the world's most dangerous weapon. At the heart of the Iran deal was a giant fiction that a murderous regime desired only a peaceful nuclear energy program. Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
This is by far the most mainstream of Donald Trump's foreign policy decisions. And it's also the one I find the most baffling. I mean, I can in good conscience blame Donald Trump alone for not having a plan for what to do next. The neoconservative think tanks that told him to do it also have no plan. The Israelis who begged for it have no plan. The Saudis have no plan. Iran just has the ability to build a nuclear weapon now, and there's literally nothing they can do about it. So why in God's name did they want this? I can only chalk it up to a sort of mass epidemic of psychotic wishful thinking. A belief that Obama made a deal not because there was no military option, but because secretly there actually was a great military option just sitting in a secret cabinet somewhere, and Obama was just too much of a wimp to implement it. Well, 12 years after Netanyahu announced that Iran was months away from a nuclear bomb, the Israelis still haven't pulled the trigger. A brief editor's note. I wrote those words before the airstrike exchange between Israel and Iran. Never even worried about needing to edit it. It was never going to happen. Trump's move ended up discrediting the Iranian politicians who negotiated it. President Rouhani and his foreign minister, Javad Zarif. Undeterred, the Ayatollah shelved them and gave the reins to the IRGC, who immediately started launching attacks on oil tankers in the Gulf.
Using a combination of low-altitude cruise missiles and drones to evade radar.
Robin, this comes at an extremely tense time in the region, with the U.S. warning just days ago that Iran or its proxies could be targeting maritime traffic in the oil-rich Persian Gulf region.
So much for peace through strength. This defiance was not what the Trump administration was expecting. They thought they could sanction Iran, and the sanctions would immediately drive the Iranians back to the negotiating table, begging for a new, better deal. Instead, Iran responded by starting a new tanker war that threatened to raise oil prices in the middle of an election year. But then Trump got bailed out.
Anger, frustration, and growing concern in Tehran as people protested against the 200% increase in fuel prices.
With the protests, the Trump administration, now being spearheaded by Mike Pompeo, changed tack and said that actually the point of the sanctions had never been to get a better deal, but to bring about a regime change by way of popular revolt. And so, actually, everything was going according to plan. And so the Iranians, either because they needed the distraction or because they genuinely believed Pompeo, decided to escalate their attacks on the Americans.
This is new video of the drama unfolding in Baghdad today. That's the U.S. Embassy surrounded by massive clouds of smoke. Hundreds of Iraqi protesters stormed the building this morning. They managed to make their way inside while U.S. troops were still present.
So Trump escalated against them.
Shortly after arriving at Baghdad International Airport, Major General Qasem Soleimani was killed in a U.S. drone strike.
And the Iranians got ready to escalate again, but then Trump got bailed out by circumstance again.
And we begin tonight with the growing certainty from U.S. intelligence that it was an Iranian missile that brought down that passenger jet that crashed outside Tehran.
And then COVID hit and just put everything on ice for 2 years. But while COVID tamped things down in Mesopotamia, things were heating up in North Africa. After the revolution, Libya formed a National Transitional Council to keep the country from collapsing while a new government was organized. After a year of political wrangling, the NTC held new elections for a constitutional congress called the General National Congress, which was then given 18 months to write a new constitution. They missed that deadline, which triggered a fail-state clause in the interim agreement to hold new elections and hand over power to a new House of Representatives. But that election and handover was declared invalid by the Supreme Court. But there was still no constitution, and with no constitution to fall back on for what to do next, neither side was willing to concede the legitimacy of the other. So Libya now had two legislative bodies, the GNC and the House of Representatives, both claiming to be Libya's rightful government. And during all of this, none of the hundreds of militias that had arisen in the revolution had actually been disarmed, and they began picking sides. So with the constitutional crisis, the country broke apart. The result wasn't a full-blown civil war, but a sort of ambient chaos. More Lebanon than Syria. Enter Khalifa Haftar, a Gaddafi general who turned on Gaddafi after getting captured by Chad in the Toyota War. He had been spirited out of Africa by the CIA, who set him up in Virginia where he lived for the next 20 years and became an American citizen. But during the revolution, he flew back to Libya to volunteer himself as a leader of the new republic's army. He then won popular acclaim in the East by chasing out the Islamist militias that had taken control of Benghazi. When the country split up between its two governments, Haftar sided with the House of Representatives. I say sided with, really, he had taken over. He's the one with the army after all. Now at this point, the State Department and the United Nations recognized the GNC. and tried to start a reconciliation process to get a ceasefire between the two sides. But the Saudis and the Emiratis had other ideas. Now, we have to go back to Saudi Arabia and their weird passive-aggressive war on Qatar. While both sides in the Libyan conflict have Islamist militants, Haftar made a point of advertising himself as the real secularist, who would basically return Libya to status quo antebellum, including not just the suppression of radical Islamic militants, but any political movement associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Saudis and Emiratis, happy for another opportunity to roll back the Arab Spring, decided to arm Haftar to the teeth, while Qatar, on the other hand, had thrown in their lot with the GNC. But it was only in 2019 that the situation broke out into a real war. Haftar, tired of negotiating, decided he wanted to take the whole country by force. The Saudis and Emiratis agreed. The Egyptians, who wanted peace on their border, also agreed to chip in. Together they enlisted, you guessed it, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, who was looking for a way to get more favorable oil contracts and a Libya that would do more to keep migrants from crossing the Mediterranean Sea. They then went to Vladimir Putin, who had always believed that the Libyan revolution was an American power play to take Libya out of the Russian sphere of influence. So he jumped at an opportunity to roll back the revolution. To this end, he enlisted a little-known oligarch named Dmitry Prigozhin, and dispatched his new little mercenary company called Wagner Group to Libya to help Haftar. Haftar now had the combined force of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, France, and Russia. There was only one last question. How would the Americans respond? If they put their foot down, the war couldn't work. Well, knowing the State Department would oppose any war, the president of Egypt, through Jared Kushner and Steve Bannon, organized a direct phone call directly between Trump and Haftar, in which Haftar would ask Donald Trump for his personal public support in his mission to defeat terrorism, probably without explaining what that would really mean.
But it appears to reverse US policy on Libya. It confirms that President Donald Trump spoke with General Khalifa Haftar, that is the man in charge of the military force which is currently attacking the UN-backed government in Tripoli, that it recognized Haftar's significant role in fighting terrorism and securing Libya's oil resources.
So the mission was now a go. For a while, it seemed like Haftar would win, but the GNC had allies of its own. Qatar wasn't the only country that had formed a relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood after the revolution in Egypt. In both the emergence of Egyptian democracy and its crushing by a military coup, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, saw echoes of his own country, and so he was eager to step in to help the GNC. In addition to Turkey, the Italians of all people also decided to step in for the GNC, since Italy had signed a backroom deal with the GNC-affiliated warlords to help keep migrants away from their islands. What I find most interesting about this war, besides the degree to which it was ignored by the media, is how unnecessary it was. Libya is not all that important to any of these countries. The reason they all decided to turn it into a game of Risk and kill 10,000 people in the process is because the State Department was effectively decapitated. They just did it because they could, because the mods were asleep. It's just thousands of people died because the President of the United States was too much of a dipshit to read his briefing book, and the country around him couldn't be bothered to give a shit about the damage that would do. The war in Afghanistan was the most enduring symbol of what was increasingly being called the Forever War. But actually, withdrawing troops from Afghanistan presents a dilemma. If you pull out troops, the Afghan government will fall, and the Taliban will take over, which will be devastating politically to whoever is president at the time of the fall. But if you don't pull out troops, you open yourself up to the accusation that you're a warmonger. Obama, as he was always inclined to do, tried to make both sides happy by splitting the difference and withdrawing most of the troops, but leaving enough in to keep the major cities unmolested. And he was immediately accused of being no different than the neocons by the populist left, and accused of sabotaging a plan that would have permanently made Afghanistan stable if he had only stuck to it for another 6 more months by the neoconservative right. Trump's solution to this dilemma was so bluntly cynical, I almost admire it. Trump simply cut the Afghan government out of the loop, directly negotiated a surrender to the Taliban, and set the date of withdrawal to take place right after the next presidential election. Then, after the election, but before Biden's inauguration, he purged the Pentagon and put in a new class of loyalists with orders to sabotage the withdrawal by pulling out as many troops as precipitously as possible, thus saddling Joe Biden with a heightened version of the old Afghanistan dilemma. Either pull out the unsustainably small deployment before Afghanistan is ready for the handover and trigger an immediate collapse, or redeploy more soldiers to make it more sustainable for a more orderly handover. But in doing so, violate the agreement with the Taliban and bear the accusation that you escalated the war you promised to end. Biden made his choice, and Trump got to become Schrodinger's peace candidate. The president who deserves all the credit for ending the war, but none of the blame for the consequences of ending the war. You can't call it a stupid strategy, but the question is this: are we that stupid?
I will end every single international crisis that the current administration has created, including the horrible war with Russia and Ukraine, which would have never happened if I was president.
The convoluted nature of policy, especially foreign policy, means that causes and effects can be separated by years. The consequences of a bad policy and the benefits of a good policy are not usually reaped during the presidency of whoever made the policy. This is perhaps worse on the issue of climate change, where the gap between policy and effect is so distant as to be unfalsifiable. And maybe it's too much to ask for voters to do the work of going back and actually looking at real causes and effects. And whoever wins an election is always ultimately not going to be about merit, but about dumb luck of timing. But Trump has introduced a new approach that may be more dangerous. Knowingly implementing bad policies, but in a way where the consequences only happen after you leave office. Previous presidents did not do this, for the simple reason that they were afraid they would be called out on it. Trump is betting that the current climate of distrust for experts will protect him from anyone who points out his game. And I'm worried about what will happen if such a transparently cynical strategy works. I mean, assume all the dooming about how Trump will destroy democracy is wrong. Every following presidential candidate is still going to look to Trump for lessons on how to win. You could already see this happen with how Trump corrupted the Democratic Party after 2016. Candidates went from treating voters like they were 10 to treating voters like they were 4. And Biden has been terrified of making even the slightest challenge to special interests, lest he end up getting shanked like Obama. In fact, that's the reason his foreign policy has been so bad. Outside of Ukraine, there's more continuity between him and Trump than between him and Obama. If Trump wins because voters are so bad at connecting cause and effect that you can engineer their blame like Pavlov's dogs by just timing things right, every president is going to start using the same tactics. Whatever constitutional crisis comes and goes, that institutional rot will remain. It won't just be one president, but a bipartisan dynasty of presidents like this. People sometimes like to dismiss criticism of Trump by saying that he is basically the same as any other president. The only real difference is how he says things. But in diplomacy, what you say is policy. It turns out that when you are the president of the United States, being a huge blundering dumbass who constantly says stupid shit really does, in and of itself, get people killed. You can see it now in Ukraine. It's not just that Trump's statements have had effects only for the past 4 years either. The time gap between policy communication and consequences can happen the other way. The anticipation of a new Trump term is already hurting Ukraine right now. The reason Putin is ramping up the violence and throwing so much armor at the wall in Donetsk despite a looming tank shortage is because he's gambling on Trump freezing the line in February. So he's trying to grab as much land in the East as possible. There's a precedent for Trump's style of doing foreign policy. Constantly saying careless things, massive mood swings between over-the-top threats, and going over the head of diplomats in favor of poorly thought-out schemes. That precedent is the Kaiser Wilhelm. I will leave it to you to decide if Kaiser Wilhelm's policy was effective at preventing a world war.